This work, and Kate said I've looked at over 300 coffins. Really, when you put it with my dissertation work, it's over 400, and it's rather insane. And when one gets mired in coffin studies, you're dealing with databases and spreadsheets and copyright issues, and it's quite time-consuming morass of data. And so it comes as a great relief, a pause, a moment of reflection for me to work on these trade books instead, to go from one kind of work to another. And this has worked quite well for me as an Egyptologist. Sometimes I'm deep in the spreadsheet and I'm trying to figure things out and using academic jargon. Many of you in the audience know what I'm talking about. And other times I'm writing for the public and I'm trying to make Egypt relevant, and I'm looking at the world through, well, okay, let me put it this way. An Egyptologist like Kate and I would never ask each other why we study Egyptology, though we both know that it's the question we're probably most commonly answered. When did you decide to be an Egyptologist? Why are you an Egyptologist? But we both know that for whatever weird, cracked, crazy reason, we see the world around us better or best through the lens of the ancient world. I don't know why, but I am able to understand systems of government, economic systems. I'm able to understand systems of power best by looking at it through the lens of my beloved ancient Egypt and then applying it to the present day. Not only that, Egypt affords us an amazing gift, which is 3,000 years of more or less the same governmental system, same cultural system, same religious system, same language. And within those 3,000 years, you've got a series of ups and downs. You have boom and bust. You have collapse and regeneration. And we can see the human reactions to all of those. And that is an extraordinary gift to be able to say, this is the way human beings react when X happens. This is the way humans react when Y happens. And so I am here as an Egyptologist to tell you that in this age of anti-intellectualism, where people are saying, what good is a history degree? I'm like, well, let me tell you. Egyptology is incredibly useful, and it's useful for studies of women and women in power. I teach a class at UCLA called Women in Power in the Ancient World, and I've been doing this class for the last 5 years. And I spend half of the class on Egypt, and then I spend a week on Persia, a week on Rome, a week on China, a week on the Levant and Mesopotamia. And I'm doing a comparative study on why we don't trust women in the halls of power, why it is so very hard for women to attain real political power. And I'm not interested in this class or in this book about women whispering something to the king behind the throne trying to get what she wants. I'm not interested in that kind of informal power. I'm interested in formal expressions of political power. When do we give it to women? When do we not? And Egypt is this strange and cracked place, which I will discuss, that allows women into power more regularly and systematically than anywhere in the ancient world, and more regularly and systematically than we allow into power today. In the longer version of this talk that I do with the National Geographic Institute Association group, what are they? A society, that's what they are. I have a whole discussion about how women do not have power today, economically, politically, militarily, or ideologically. And then I go into the anthropological reasons for that, what it's like in a hunter-gatherer society, what it's like in an agricultural society, and then we're all thoroughly depressed. And then I go to Egypt and I say, but Egypt was able to surmount these obstacles and allowed women into power in a way that no other agricultural society did. And then I ask, why is that? And I continue, and I hope this haunts you as I go through 6 women who achieved formal states of power in Egypt. I hope the question haunts you, why do we in our society still not allow women into power? And why is this our reality? This is from before the last election, right? You see Paul Ryan, you're like, no, you have to update this. And you're right, I do have to update it. But nothing speaks to what I'm talking about now better than the last Congress. Because the last Congress was incredibly masculine, incredibly white, lacked diversity on all fronts. And it made me realize that when people are afraid, because I think this country, right and left, the thing that unites us the most is the fear that we are all falling over the cliff, right? That's what we can all agree on. We may have completely different ways for how to heal that problem, but we all are very afraid. And when people are afraid, they often turn towards the patriarchy, whatever that is. We can break that down. They turn towards what makes them feel safe, that decisive masculine power. They turn towards this same way of doing things, or they even turn towards an authoritarianism, which is the subject of my next book, which I don't have time to talk about either. But it interests me that the way fear makes people turn towards certain directions of power, and that females have nothing to do with that. So now we come to this topic of women in power in ancient Egypt and why this was such a systematic and regular thing. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to be talking about 6 women, 5 of whom became nothing less than leaders of state, king, right? And I'm not talking about the dozens of other women that acted as regent for a young king, coming in, pulling the strings of the government, and then when that boy is old enough, stepping back into the shadows, letting him run the show. I'll be talking about 1 and a half, in a sense. But I'm leaving those women out of this discussion and focusing on the women that were able to take that kind of power and move it a step beyond. But this is a place that allows women into power so often that we need to question why that is. And so I am led to a map. In my class, Women in Power in the Ancient World, I usually start with a map of each region. And I show the map and I say, oh, this doesn't look so great. Can you guys kind of see it, more or less? The Nile is there. You get some understanding of what's going on. Is this place unitable? Is this place protected? Is this place geographically in tune with the allowance of female power? Seems a strange question for me to ask, right? How can you look at a map and know that females will be allowed into power or not? Well, you actually can. And the more I taught the class Women in Power in the Ancient World, the more I realized, oh my goodness, you know, you can look at a map and decide, will women be able to rule in this place? Now, Egypt is a very different and special geographic region, unique. It is protected on all 4 sides. It's got deserts on east and west. On the east, you can add the Red Sea just to make it a little harder to invade, Mediterranean Sea to the north, and then down to the south, where you have this artery of the Nile cutting through the desert. And of course, the Nile is the only reason anything exists in Egypt at all, is a gift of that Nile. In the south, at a place called Elephantine, and then 5 or 6 times further south, you have these giant granite boulders in the middle of the river. So even if you wanted to bring some naval invading force with all your ships straight up the river, you'd hit those granite blocks, and you and your naval force would have to take the boats out of the river, go around, just carry them around the boulders, put them back in the water, and then head up north again. So even the south is protected. This is a place that does not suffer foreign invasion very often for most of its history. It is a place where different ethnicities and different languages and different religious systems coming into this place, for most of its pharaonic history, this is quite rare. Until the invasion of a series of empires, starting with the Assyrian, going with the Babylonian, then the Persians, then Alexander the Great, this place existed in a microcosm of safety, where you can have the same language, the same religious system, the same government for over 3,000 years. This is a very special and protected place, a place where warlording is not the norm. Compare this in your minds to what you hear in the news about Syria, Mesopotamia, what we would call Iraq, or Rome or Greece in the ancient world. There you have places that are much more competitive and geographically do not have the same barriers that this place has to protect it. Warlording pays dividends. You will be rewarded for raising an army, marching into Babylon, taking out the king, and claiming that city as your own, and you know you might just win. Whereas here, warlording is discouraged either geographically from the outside in, but it's also discouraged within. Because within you have this Nile that floods its banks when it's doing it as it's supposed to. The Egyptians would tell us there is a way that it should work and a way that it shouldn't. Not too much flooding, not too little flooding. But every year it floods its banks and it leaves behind this thick layer of rich Nile silt. You sprinkle your seeds on it, you let your animals and your children run on it, and just, a couple weeks later, you have fat, juicy kernels of wheat and barley. Herodotus in the 5th century visited this place, and he's like, damn, this is insane. He's like, in Greece, we have to move the rocks, and then we have to plow, and it's so hard. In Egypt, you're just like, la, la, la. And everyone's drunk, and there's too many people, and nobody has to work that hard, and it's awesome. That creates a kind of society too. It creates a society where you don't need to warlord because you don't have the same kinds of scarcity that you have in Mesopotamia or the Levant or Greece or Rome. And so warlording on the inside is discouraged as well. And indeed, we compare Egyptian politics to Greece or Rome at our peril, because regicide in Egypt, you can count them on the fingers of one hand, the ones that we know about. This is a very rare and unusual thing. This is a place that geographically and culturally has developed the most perfected form of divine kingship the world has ever seen, where you might have problems in the kingship. There could be an issue with the succession. And the king dies early after only 10 years of rule, and he leaves an 8-year-old son of his choice behind, in addition to many other sons, but he leaves this 8-year-old behind. And in any other part of the world, in Mesopotamia or Greece or Rome, the guy holding the bloody knife who just killed the 8-year-old and all of the 8-year-old's family holds it up and he's like, I'm king next. And everyone's like, yep, you are. Good for you. You're king. And in Egypt, everyone throws themselves to the ground and they're like, dear 8-year-old, what would you like us to do? I have an 8-year-old boy who was born under the full moon of Taurus. And I didn't used to believe in that stuff until I had a kid who was born under the full moon of Taurus. And now, trust me, I understand what willfulness means and how it is given to us by the gods. But I do not want that kid in charge of my house, let alone my nation, right? So you have to come up with a different method that's going to keep this divine kingship safe and functioning. In Mesopotamia, the Levant, Greece, or Rome, if you let a kid rule, you're going to have somebody older come in and make decisions on his behalf, and you're probably going to have a man do so. What's going to happen if an uncle of the kid comes in and rules on his behalf, the brother of the dead king? I have a saying amongst my students at UCLA. It's a very useful saying. It's very short. Many of you may have heard it before if you've heard me speak. And the saying is 2 words, and it is because testicles. I say it so much that a grad student made me a T-shirt that says because testicles. And then she put the hieroglyph for the penis on it. I'm like, I can never wear the shirt. What do you expect? I can't. So I just lovingly put it aside, and it is just in a drawer, and I can never wear it in sparkly glitter paint, whatever. But because testicles, you can't have the uncle of the young kid come in and be the decision maker. I'm not saying he's necessarily going to assassinate the kid, but the chances are higher, right? It is riskier. Whereas if you have a woman come in, mother of the kid, maybe the aunt, we'll discuss, it's going to be less risky. And this brings up the other thing I want to haunt you as we're talking about this. Do women rule differently from men? In some way, in the way I hear yeses, and often I'll hear no's. And I don't think we as a society have completely figured this out yet because we don't let them rule. So we don't know what the options are yet. But the Egyptians believed that women ruled differently. And the Egyptians, to keep this system running and to keep it safe, systematically allowed the woman to come in to keep the divine kingship safe, to keep it working. And here's the most uncomfortable part of working through this book, working through the female power. I'm not here to write a revisionist history for you. I'm not here to make you feel happy and cushy with rainbows and puppy love about the women of the past. I am here to tell you the truth as a historian. And the uncomfortable truth for me, having gone through all of these women, is that it is in the most authoritarian state on the planet, with the most perfected divine kingship that we see female power. Only there. It is where female power is forced upon its people that it is most accepted. It is in the most unequal of social situations, the most pyramidal of social situations, that female power is allowed. Otherwise, if you go to Greece or Rome, let's go to the Greek demokratia. Very broad understanding of power. Everyone who's a citizen has a say in their assembly, right? One man falls, another man takes his place. Women have no say in this society and in this culture. Women have so little political power and men have so much that there's actually a political sexual understanding to male love in Greece. That true love, if you read your Greek text very carefully, is male-male, not female-male. The women are full of deceit and witchcraft and problems, and read your Pandora's box discussion in Hesiod. Oh my goodness. But in Egypt, the woman is what keeps this safe. The woman is the placeholder to allow this patriarchy to continue. That's the uncomfortable reality for me. And I just wrote a piece in Time magazine about this, that the woman usually serves the patriarchy without even thinking about it, without even knowing what she's doing. It doesn't matter if there's a woman in power, what is the agenda of that woman? So this is very much my discussion for today. If women do rule differently, what is their agenda? How are we to understand their place in this society? Now, many of you in the audience might be annoyed that I have used the word female king twice. Be like, why does she do that? That's stupid. She could just use the word queen. We do, and I will say, in the ancient Egyptian language, the word queen connotes no power. It is a sexual helpmate of the king. It is something that it has nothing to do with politics or decision making. When the Egyptians chose a woman to be king, in this case Hatshepsut from obelisk, and you see the central column there, the top word, nesut is used. They use the word king, so I'm going to use the word king. That's the way I've decided to do it. So just a little justification there so I don't get that question in the Q&A, which I always do otherwise. So now I want to go through our 6 women. How much time do I have until 2:40? Who's running the show? 2:50? Okay. All right. So we'll go through these, really 5, because I don't have a whole lot of time for Tawosret here, and she's more Game of Thrones than you can possibly imagine. So we're going to skip over her, and I can stand here by the podium and say, you can buy the book, which is awesome. But let's start with Merneith of Dynasty 1 and gain an understanding that this female power in ancient Egypt to protect an authoritarian patriarchal regime, yeah, those words just rolled off my tongue. The female power is the other side of the coin of that patriarchal regime. It comes with it. You have to have the one without the other. There is no way to avoid the female power. You could argue, and the Egyptologists in the room know what I'm talking about, that there are Dynasty 0 examples of very, very strong female power. Merneith is just the most well-documented for us to start with, but it could have even had an earlier beginning. So when Egyptologists found Merneith's tomb, they found it in a place called Abydos, Middle Egypt, along the Nile, out in the western desert sands. And they looked at the layout of the tomb, and they looked at the horizontal stratigraphy. They're like, king's tomb there, now we're digging here, must be another king's tomb. They find the grave marker, the stela, and they look at that, and they're like, yep, looks like the others, we're all good, it's a king. And then they start to look and compare, and they're like, wait a minute, something's missing. Something's a little bit off. There are 2 things missing from Merneith's stela, Merneith, whose name means the beloved one of the goddess Neith. The name is not really going to help us. There's no T at the end. Egyptian names are useful. It's Smurf or Smurfette, right? So it's the same with Merneith. Some would be like, no, there is a T. Some would be like, no, there's not. But it depends on how it's written. But the 2 things that are missing are the falcon at the top, Horus incarnate, kingship on earth, and the palace facade, that mud brick walled fortress that goes around the inner sanctum where the king and his court dwell. Those 2 things are missing from her stela. So the Egyptologists are like, I wonder what's going on. And then they find a tiny little label, this big, affixed to a commodity in one of the, in her, well, I don't want to give it away, in one of the later king's tombs. And this tiny little label, they see, okay, we have Jer, we have Jet, we have Den, and then what have we got here? We have the king's mother, Merneith. So they're like, oh, it's not exactly the correct lineup, but she's named as the king's mother. They're like, I got it. She's there as the regent. Jet must have died too early, leaving Den on the throne too young, demanding somebody to be the decision maker, somebody to act as regent. Who better than the king's mother? This starts off in Dynasty 1. As soon as they can do it, they institute this as a pattern and as a system. Now, how did she get there? How does this work? I say her father, Jer, and in the book I talk about the king Jer as her father, given how high Merneith's station is. It is an assumption that I make, and I'm clear about it in the book. It's possible this guy is not her father, but we'll leave it there for now. But Merneith would have been a girl when this very powerful and long-lived King Jer died. And this would have been one of her earliest memories, a memory seared into her brain, because at Jer's death, and at the death of any First Dynasty king, the courtiers were separated, and it was determined who among them would accompany the king into death themselves. So they were sacrificed. We don't know the method. I'll show you some of the skeletons. They could have been poisoned, they could have been strangled, they could have been stabbed. We've got nothing. There's very little evidence. And the archaeologists who found most of these skeletons only kept the heads. Annoying, right? I have a graduate student, Rose Campbell, for those of you that know her, who's working on isotope analysis, and she's heading to London and Cambridge soon, where there are hundreds of such heads. And she's going to be looking at these skulls and determining where these people grew up, because you can tell that from the isotopes, what kind of health and nutrition they had. And this work has not been done yet. But the work that has been done suggests that the people who were sacrificed to surround the king's tomb were buried at one time and were wealthy people, well-nourished people, people who were probably courtiers, people with whom you shared a meal, people who were probably family members of yours. And when Jair dies, hundreds of people met their end. Think of this. We have this phrase, the king is dead, long live the king, right? Well, think of it this way. The king is dead, long live the king. You say it fast like that because you don't want any vulnerability coming in between. You know it's a time period of great potential problems. You want to make sure everybody's safe and everybody's taken care of, that you go to the next kingship when you're moving from one government to another. And to make this more seamless, the Egyptians of the first dynasty hit upon a rather brilliant but macabre and brutal plan, which is to show the king's power over life and death itself. And to also, I would argue, take out potential threats from society. So if you're worried about, you've got your king, you place him on the throne, who are you most worried about as you do that in that most vulnerable situation? Well, you're worried about the other guys who could have taken that position. Those are the ones who are most of a threat to the guy who's sitting on the throne. He's the one, in a sense, that needs this sacrifice. You put them around the burial of the king before, but really the dead do not bury themselves. This is about the guy who's sitting on the throne now and what he needs in the here and now. And what the guy who comes next, Jet, after Jair's burial, needs now is some sacrifice of older men, but not a whole lot. Jair has more females buried in his tomb than he has males. And this is based on archaeological reports that are problematic, but we're gonna leave it there. But he has a great number of dead that accompany him. And I would argue that any threats to the throne are eliminated in a very quick couple of weeks as they put this man to death. Each person gets their own little marker, their own name, a little designation of their gender. Even if you can't tell from a skeleton what the gender is, you can use these markers to determine what the gender is. Ellen Morris is the person whose work I follow the most on this. Laurel Bestock as well, if you guys want to follow up. Now, Merneith is not slated for sacrifice, but she may have seen her own mother die in front of her eyes. We have no way of knowing. This is history from 5,000 years ago. But the burial of the king would have been accompanied by a keening and mourning that we have no concept of. Imagine somebody very important dying, and then imagine that they take out 500 other very important people right in front of your eyes, and you have to watch that in a ritual. Absolutely brutal. Merneith watches all of that. She marries the next king, the guy Jet. She then watches as he dies, and then the selection is made again. Now, he dies a little too early. He dies leaving Den, her son, to rule before his time. For however this happens, and this is one of the most mysterious things about any authoritarian regime, how is the successor to the throne chosen? How is this choice made? What is the realpolitik? How is the regent chosen? Do they choose the successor by which regent is best, or other way around? We don't know. But Merneith is chosen as regent, her son is the king. And now who's going to be in charge of the selection at the death of her husband? Well, we have to assume it's her. So you have to look at this again as the dead do not bury themselves. The living are the ones who are doing this. The kid on the throne is too young. Let's assume he's 12 years old. Not ready to rule yet, but not incredibly young either. And Merneith is the one saying, him, 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 her and him. And these people are all sacrificed in front of everybody else. Merneith doesn't have to die because she's there as queen regent, but I imagine she sacrificed or saw sacrifice many women her age who accompanied her husband maybe from the harem into his burial place. She's the one that's calling the shots. Each one gets a little burial marker of their own. Each one gets a room of his or her own, in a sense. This is a very brilliant, if brutal, plan of making sure that everyone understands who has the power. This is an interesting, if you look at comparative anthropology and you look at incipient states, you look at nascent states, this is a feature you see in Africa and Europe and Asia, in the New World, that in these states, when a kingship is new, sacrificial burial often goes along with it for the king. It is a great and quick, efficient means of showing who has the power and that you better move along with this and not rock the boat. Do what you need to do. This is what the dead look like as they're buried. They're accompanied with these markers, with grave goods, sometimes with jewelry, buried on their side in a fetal position as if they're sleeping. There are no marks of murder. Nothing. So even though we have symbols like little labels like this, and in the top right corner you see somebody stabbing somebody in the chest, that seems to be more of an enemy combatant. This doesn't seem to be what we're talking about here. Matthew Adams, the archaeologist who works at Abydos now, he thinks it's a mass cyanide death. This like a Jonestown kind of thing, right? A Guyana punch sort of deal. And that was a really easy way to dispatch hundreds of people in public in one moment. We don't know. Until we have better access to the bioarchaeological remains, this is going to remain a mystery for some time. Now, Den rules. He has the best and greatest rule of all of the Dynasty I kings. He expands Egypt's borders the farthest that they've ever been expanded. Merneith is there alongside him for much of his rule. And when she dies in his reign, she is buried like a king. She does not ever receive the status of a king herself. She's not a co-king. She is just a regent. Her status is completely informal. And yet she's buried in the lineup of other kings. She's put into the king list as king's mother. She's afforded an incredible amount of status. And yet a pattern, given a tomb like this as reconstructed, and yet just 2 generations later, she's already removed from the king list. This is a pattern that we will see repeated. The woman is there as a placeholder in the moment to keep the patriarchal system going, to link from one king to the next, from one patriarch to the next. If you need a woman to keep the system safe, everyone's going to be okay with it. They're going to include her in the king list during the time, but then as soon as they move on to somebody who's disconnected from her, she's got to go. She doesn't fit. And so then we see all of these kings moving in this direction. You've got the Jer, Jet, Den, and then you move on to a different king. No mention of Merneith anywhere in the list. So now we're going to skip a number of dynasties and go up to Dynasty 12. Those of you that want me to talk about Nitocris, it's in the book. There are no contemporary documents for her during that time period, so we will not be able to speak about her as an actual living person. But Neferusobek we can. Some of you may know her as Sobek Neferu. Much disagreement about how her name should be pronounced and spoken. We'll leave it this way for now. This woman was born into a very formidable dynasty, an incredibly strong dynasty, a dynasty that begins with a regicide and then is very protective from that point on, making sure that it keeps the money and the power and the influence within the family. Her grandfather was the formidable Tawosret III, who also expanded Egypt's borders farther than we've ever seen, who lived very, very long. And his son is Amenemhet III. This is Neferusobek's father. Also a very, very strong king. Both of them great builders, both of them making statuary that was so successful aesthetically that it was reused for millennia afterwards. She may have married Amenemhet IV. This is where the history starts to get really problematic. And those of you that know that you're into the 12th dynasty history, how many of you are there? That's right. No hands at all. I like that. Good, because it's very problematic. Some people think that this guy wasn't a king's son at all and that he's marrying into the family. Other people think this was a king's son. We're never going to know these things. Remember, an authoritarian regime is not going to give away its secrets. It's going to give away only perfection, idealism. Everything is the way it should be. He's depicted as a king's son. He names himself as a king's son. I'm going to go along with it. Not going to hurt me. Though I do believe as an Egyptologist, it is my responsibility to try to figure out what these guys are telling us by not telling us. I'm distrustful of all of the data. I don't like to drink the Kool-Aid, as I think most Egyptologists do. We accept the authoritarian regime and the information we're given, and we don't question the data enough, trying to figure out what the propaganda is and what the realpolitik could be behind the propaganda. But here we've got this dude, Amenemhet IV, who is married to Neferusobek, may have been her half-brother, maybe not, we don't know, but he dies, and there is no heir to the throne in any way, shape, or form that we can identify. There's nobody. There's nobody left. So what do we have instead but maybe a problem with incest in ancient Egypt? I don't know. But I do know that incest happened in ancient Egypt pretty regularly. Tutankhamun is an example of it. We have other kings. The Dynasty 19, Siptah had a club leg and was probably a product of incest. The Ptolemies are well known for their incestuous pairings. Hell, European monarchs are well known for their own incestuous pairings. I have a picture of Charles II here with his ginormous head that needed a special pillow and his overly large jaw. And we could think of Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia, and his hemophilia also being a product of incest. Incest is a very useful tool, especially in a dynasty that's trying to keep power inside of its own system and not give it all away. This is the best I've got as a solution for why you could have such strong kings and then all of a sudden have nothing and end up with a female king. How could that possibly happen? How could the harem just come up empty? Well, we've seen it before in ancient Egypt, and we'll see it later. This is the best solution that I have to this problem, though it's not necessarily the only one. But it results in Egypt's first female kingship. Let me go back to the incest a little bit, because who doesn't want to talk about that more? Think about it, because a lot of you in the audience are probably like, those ancient Egyptians, they're so stupid and primitive, and why would they even do something so ridiculous? We would never do that. I'm like, well, really? Because all this is a short-term decision based on the opportunism of the moment. So let's put it this way. If you're an elite, a very high-level elite, a courtier in the palace, and you're one of 4 other guys who is able to whisper when the king is sick and the decision you guys make could actually hold some weight. And you guys are talking with each other, and you're like, okay, well, we have a couple of choices. What do you guys think? You're not going to put this down in writing. Authoritarian regimes don't do that. You're going to talk about it. You're going to be like, okay, well, we've got a couple of choices. We've got this strong, strapping lad whose in-laws are from the south, and they have their own private army, and they all want to have jobs if we bring him in as king. Or we could get the rather dim-witted, large-headed, incestuous product of the brother-sister kingly marriage, and all our jobs would be awesome, and we'd go on as before. And everyone's like, yeah, let's do that. Let's go with that short-term solution. And if you think we don't make short-term solutions, just think of global warming and climate change. And this being what, the 4th hottest summer the world has ever, or year that the world has ever seen, and we still all have plastic water bottles in our bags, and there's a plastic island between here and Hawaii, and yet we never do anything to change the system because there will be job loss or whatever. And so we all continue to make our short-term decision to kick the can down the road a little bit more instead of thinking of the long-term repercussions. Human beings are not good at long-term decision-making at all. Which is another thing that I've noticed from ancient Egypt and is a good thing to apply to the modern world, if a depressing one. Now, the first female kingship that Neferusobek creates is an interesting one because she shows herself as a woman. She has breasts, she's wearing a dress, but she layers the kingship onto her person. She ties a masculine kingly kilt over her dress, and she puts that Nemi's headdress under her head, the one you know from Tut's mask in your mind's eye. That's what she puts on, and so she's not hiding the fact that she's a woman. She is layering these elements of kingship upon her person. Her kingship lasts for just a few years, about 4 at most, though there's disagreement about this, and she leaves no legacy. One of the most interesting things to me about Neferusobek is that the Egyptians let her get away with it at all, because there's no heir to the throne that we can see. There's only this woman left. They know that Dynasty 12 is going to end, and it's going to go to well, they don't call it Dynasty 12, right? But they know it's going to end, and they're going to go to Dynasty 13. Why bother? Well, because in this system of divine kingship, she is the last holder of that royal ka, that spirit of kingship. And everyone bows down to her. She's the last recipient of it, so she gets to finish it out. That's an extraordinary thing in and of itself. But Neferusobek her decision-making should not be overlooked because she also justifies it in a way that works for the people around her so they don't see it as a threat. And the way that she does that is that she justifies her kingship through her father's lineage, not by mentioning her dead husband brother. She doesn't go about, this is why we don't know who Amenemhet IV was, because she gives him so little play. She doesn't talk about him. She doesn't name him. She doesn't make any monuments to him. His name is nowhere connected to her stuff, but her father's name is everywhere. And that is useful for her. And it's something that we actually understand as well. We trust more those women who are coming in as leaders in a strict linear progression. We trust more the woman who's protecting her son in power. We trust more the daughter who's acting for her father in power than we do the sister or the wife. And I can give you an easy political example from the last 20 years. You guys are probably thinking of it right now, no? You're thinking of Hillary Clinton in the 90s when she tried to create health care as wife of the president, informal power, a peer to her husband. Who the hell does she think she is? Everybody said it. What is going on? I don't understand how, and we feel threatened by this. It threatens our patriarchal system. But in today's White House, the base that supports the current president has no problem with Ivanka having an office in the White House, acting as an advisor for her father. And this is very cleverly done, whereas Melania is like, no, I'm not getting into that, right? She knows. She's there as the wife. She's learned from Hillary's mistakes. I am not going to try to take power, but Ivanka can do so, and she can do so with impunity because we respect that kind of patriarchal lineage. Very interesting way that female power must be packaged, and Hatshepsut knows to do this as well. And here we move on to her. So Hatshepsut of Dynasty 18 is the most powerful of all of our women. She's the one that is really able to leave Egypt better than she found it, save her dynasty, leave a legacy. She rules for about 22 years altogether, and yet most of you, maybe you guys, how many can pronounce her name well? But everyone's like, I don't know, Hatshepsut. We'll get to that. She starts out as Egypt's greatest high priestess. For those of you in the know, this would be the god's wife of Amun stationed at Thebes in the south. There were maybe other high priestesses, but for all we can see, this is the most important of them all. And she is placed into this position probably under her father, Thutmose I. She continues in this position alongside her half-brother husband, Thutmose II. Incest. Dun, dun, dun. She ends up, so altogether, she is the king's daughter, she is the king's sister, she is the king's wife, because she's married to her brother, but she never becomes a king's mother because she only gives birth to Neferusobek, a daughter. She does not give birth to a son. And so when Thutmose II, her half-brother husband, dies after only 3 years of reign, and trust me, the Egyptological discussion about this is very intense, but we'll leave it at 3 years. Because if he had 9 years of reign and that's all he produced in Egypt's temples, then what a sad king. So we'll give him 3 years. I think it's better. So if he dies after 3 years of reign, he's going to leave a bunch of 2-year-olds in the nursery. Hatshepsut's not going to have a son amongst those 2-year-olds in the nursery. And now we have a serious succession crisis. A succession crisis where the choice of the next king is probably going to be based on who the regent is rather than on who the kid is. Because they're a bunch of toddlers. Who's going to choose the possibility that the toddler is going to grow up to have a good ruling acumen in the future? You can't. But you have to be very strategic. This is a long regency. With a 2-year-old, you're talking about 14, 15, 16 years of a woman ruling on behalf of this kid. It's a long time. You have to make sure you choose wisely. It seems that Egypt had already decided they wanted Hatshepsut to be regent. She's there as the greatest high priestess. She's there bred for the position, the most elite, the king's daughter, the king's wife, the king's sister. She's ready to go. They have to choose a boy that won't be threatened by her or vice versa. So they pick a boy with a nothing mother, from all we can see, a mother that cannot step in as regent. His name will be Thutmose III to Egyptologists, just Thutmose in the moment. And she is there acting as his regent for a good 7 years. Now, people don't do anything alone. This is what I'm always hammering into my students' head. This is not a history written by individual people. This is a history of systems. Hatshepsut can't barge into a system and say, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to be king or I'm going to be regent. This is not the way things work. Hatshepsut is going to be allowed into a system by the elites around her. The elites, it seems, want her to be in this position of power. They demand that she step forward and do this. And over the next couple of years, as she's acting as regent for this toddler king, who I imagine was really hard to crown. Keep the crown. No, stop. No, stay there. kind of thing. She's there as and their texts say this, she's the rock. She's the one that's going to be clever in her strategies. She's going to keep Egypt safe. But she's already, or her advisors are already thinking about the future. Because in texts like this, from down south in Egypt, this one happens to be near Elephantine, we see Hatshepsut depicted as a god's wife of Amun, but in the text that only the top 1% can read, it says that the sun god Re has given her the kingship. She's like a lawyer. She doesn't go out and say, I am king, not yet. She's laying her foundation for that. She goes out and she says, I'm doing the job, I'm doing the kingship. I may not be king, but I'm on my way. And when the elites don't push back against this, then she and her advisors know that they've got room to run. They've been given some reins. They can really start to move now. And her first image of kingship, we see another cartouche name added, and she shows herself as a female wearing a dress, wearing masculine ram's horns and a masculine wig. So she is already, like Neferusobek, changing her image to include the masculine in addition to the feminine, kind of like the pantsuit of 1985 with the shoulder pads, right? Make you look all manly, give you a little fluffy bow tie to go along with that. She is crowned in year 7, from what we can tell, and again, the Egyptological debate about this is quite fierce. The reasons for this are unclear. This is the most frustrating part of Egyptology for me. They don't let us into their secrets. They're not going to tell us what's actually happening. We don't get a view of the realpolitik. She tells us, my father Amun-Re wanted me to be king. My father Thutmose I bred me and wanted me to be king. Very useful things to say. She's fitting herself in that patrilineal lineage, no problem. But we don't know why in year 7 she felt the need to formalize this, because she had all the power. Was there another entourage of Thutmose III who's trying to push her out? Was there another regent that was trying to push her out with another entourage? Was there a problem with Thutmose III himself? Was he lying on his deathbed with some sort of disease? Because in Egypt, it's not if you get malaria, it's when you get malaria. Did he fall off his chariot? Was something going on? We have no idea. But in year 7, probably when Thutmose III is around 9 years old, she is crowned alongside him, and now it is irrevocable. There's no going back from this. This system is completely locked down for her. And yet, this is a pattern that we'll see again with Cleopatra, she never rules alone. She's always got this kid following her. Now, there is a more crass part of my feminism that I will share with you right now. Because there's no woman if a woman rules alone in this entire lineup, she rules for a very short period of time, 1, 2, 4 years, something like that. But if she rules for a long period of time, like Cleopatra or Hatshepsut, or other women we could compare her to around the globe, we see that there's always a male accompaniment, some sort of presence alongside the female on the throne that allows her to be there. So the crass feminist part of me is like, why didn't she just have the kid assassinated? And then we could at least talk about one woman that did it, that ruled Egypt for a long period of time, and wouldn't that be great? Well, she knows, and I know, that if she had Thutmose III assassinated, however she felt about him, and maybe she loved him very, very much, I don't know. If she had him assassinated, her means to power is gone, even as king probably. She would have been swept aside as well. You need a male at the center of an authoritarian wheel of power. You need that, because just in terms of biological economy, the harem exists for a reason, right? I can have 1 baby a year. 2 is probably going to kill me, though it didn't kill Cleopatra. But I can have 1 baby a year. A guy can have 365 babies a year. That biological economy is something I cannot compete with. He will always win in terms of the basics of power and succession, keeping the status quo, keeping things risk averse. A woman can't compete with that. She removes that boy, then they're going to replace her with another boy, another man. So she knows she's got to keep him with her, and she never rules alone. And by year 16, she starts to depict him with her, almost like twinsies, as you see here. Same crown, same look, sometimes different crowns, but almost the exact same face, almost the exact same body type. So similar that the Egyptologists, we know, you look at their statues and you're like, it's Thutmoside, we say. We sound very clever when we say this, because we're like, it could be Hatshepsut, it could be Thutmose III, who's to know? So we say Thutmoside. It's a cool Egyptological speak for, we have no idea. But Hatshepsut did this to us. She's the one. And Thutmose III, he seems to follow along with this portraiture, which is interesting in and of itself. So now she's got the kingship. She's got the 9-year-old who's growing up, becoming a 16-year-old and a strong man right next to her. He's probably training with the army off to the north. Maybe she's in the south. We actually don't know a lot of these details. But what we do see is that more jobs, more professions are created under her than at any other time. The Egyptologists know that we have to commit all kinds of crazy things to memory. Statues, stela, tombs, coffins, what's in what museum, where is this, where is that? And we know that when Hatshepsut takes the throne, this stuff explodes in quantity and quality. That means that she has to give to get. That means that when she takes this power position, she and her entourage know that the elites are like, this is great. This is a very aberrant situation. And you're like, yeah, okay, what would you like? Well, my son would love to be in the treasury. Okay, got it. What would you like? Okay, well, my son would love to be, one of the overseers of the scribes of the house of Amun. You got it. And so the jobs are created like candy, in a sense. There's another Egyptologist named David Warburton who argues that it's during Hatshepsut's reign when Egypt's treasury, the crown, loses more power than at any other time in the long term, because the treasury is giving out more funds than it had ever given out before. That's a little more debatable because Hatshepsut kept such good control of the money and created more income streams. She knew that she needed to bring in more money, so what do? You start a little war, you invade a little Nubia, and you bring a lot of gold into Egypt. So she knew to do that right off. She also knew to place people in control of that money who only had her to depend on and who had no other conflicting interests. So she picks a dude like this, Senenmut, who's not a patrician, not one of the old families, and she elevates him to a station that everyone is like, whoa, really? She's like, yeah, really. And he's like, what would you like, my liege? because he's not going to try to work with other people. They're all mad that she's doing this, and she's picking a number of new men who will answer only to her. Very, very cleverly done. She has control of the temple like no one else. This woman grew up in the temple. It's in her bones. She knew that when she had herself marked for kingship, she had to do so in a way that was overtly displayed to her people. So she tells us in the texts where she is marked for rule that the bark of Amun-Re is brought out on a festival day in public in front of all of her elites, and that it moves decisively towards her. And then she throws herself on the ground, raises up her arms, and says, oh, my father Amun, what would you have me do? No one can speak against that. Once the god Amun-Re has chosen her to be king, then it is again irrevocable. It is something that cannot be overturned. She sends out expeditions to crazy faraway places that Egyptologists don't even know where they are. Maybe Eritrea, maybe Yemen. The debate goes on. She shows the details of those expeditions. She doesn't go herself. She sends other men, but it's still considered a miracle of kingship that she's doing this. Incense trees brought back roots and all. The misshapen chieftainess of Punt depicted in all of her glory next to her husband, the chief. And she builds structures that are avant-garde at the same time that they're conservative in the most holy places on the Egyptian landscape, not just in ancient Thebes, but all over the country. This was a woman who left Egypt better than she found it. And yet, throughout all of this, she cannot make Egypt fit to her. She has to fit to Egypt, and she has to fit the patriarchy. So she starts out depicting herself as a female king, putting the Nemes headdress on, putting the kilt of kingship on. Actually, here she just has a dress. And this is not enough. So we see her trying to figure this out, trying to crack it. This is my favorite statue of hers, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And she's androgynous. She's male and she's female. She has breasts, but she doesn't have nipples, so is she wearing a shirt, but I don't see any trace of it. So she's topless, but she's this gracile, heart-shaped, beautiful thing. How are we to understand this, male and female simultaneously? Well, only one such statue was made, and then she quickly moves on to statues like this. This is what most of her statues look like. Strong biceps, broad shoulders and chest, square jaw, indistinguishable from a man. She has to fit the patriarchy, cannot fit her. And as her nephew, Thutmose III, is getting older and haunting her steps, she has to become more masculine, one could argue. Did she dress like this in public, in the festivals? Did she tie on the royal beard and strap down her breasts and wear a shirt that was skin-colored? Who are we to say? Why not? This is what she's depicting, quite possibly. Did she dress like that in the palace? From the existence of this statue, I think not. But anything is possible. Until we get our time machine invented, we will continue to discuss these things for some time. So she depicts herself as as the daughter of Amun-Re, building her kingship for him. She rules for about 22 years altogether. When she dies, from all we can see, she is buried in state. We have to use a lot of circumstantial evidence to figure this out, but there is a detritus of her death. Even though her tomb was pretty thoroughly robbed, you find little things, a canopic char here, a little Shapti fragment there, a sarcophagus here. There is enough there to suggest that Hatshepsut was buried in state as a king in the Valley of the Kings by her nephew Thutmose III. And Thutmose III finished temples of hers, finished chapels, made sure that everything was good for her. And so everything's fine, right? She's going to be our successful female. Well, no, she's not. Because about 20 to 25 years later, after her death, he says, come here, you, chief of artisans, go, send the guys out. I need Hatshepsut's names and images removed from this temple, this temple, this temple, and just names all the temples. They're like, what? Really? I want you to take plaster, and I want you to replace those names with the name of my father and the name of my grandfather. Yes, sir. You, come here. Sledgehammers, send them out. I need you to smash these statues up to tiny bits, throw them out in a hole. I don't want you to do anything with those. Oh, wait, but the big colossals, I don't want you to break those up. Those are too valuable. Just switch out the names, huh? Take out her name, put in my father's name. Got it. And they go out and they do this. Now, they don't do a great job so that we Egyptologists can come in after the fact and say, oh, look, there's a T there. Remember the Smurfette? And then you see that the daughter of Re is still there, even though it's talking about Thutmose III. You're like, something's going on. Or you can see that there's an erasure, and you can see the traces of what the old name could be. In some cases, they relied so much on plaster that the old carving is as clear as day. So we can put this back together. But the end result is that Hatshepsut is not a part of our cultural memory. We can't pronounce her name. She was too successful. Success is a problematic thing. Think about it this way. If you have a really good, successful idea, it's going to bring your company a lot of business, and you tell your boss this idea, and then you hear that the boss went to a CEO meeting, and then all of a sudden your idea is bandied about as his or her idea. You're like, damn it, that was my idea. Well, it was successful. You're doing what people expect to work. What has worked before, what will work after. Success is very transferable. It is very abstract. It's failure that everyone remembers and assigns your name to. That's why you guys can pronounce Cleopatra like that. And Hatshepsut, you're like, Okay, Nefertiti, Dynasty 18. Her story is being written right now. And the Egyptologists in the room know that if we all went to a bar full of Egyptologists and we just threw out, right, and said, is Nefertiti Smenkare? Then people would come to blows, right? The people get really upset over this stuff. And indeed, the evidence is coming out of the ground right now, like as we speak. They're finding new stuff. And so it's just take all of that with a grain of salt, but that doesn't mean we can't discuss Nefertiti as a female king, because I think we can. I think most Egyptologists would accept her as such. What's cool and interesting to me is that when you hear the name Nefertiti and you see her bust from Berlin, you think of beauty. She's a pretty face, right? You don't think of her as a ruler, as anything formidable or something associated with authority in any way, but indeed she was. So let's see how this works out. She is married to this guy named Amenhotep IV, who is born into Egypt's greatest excess, its wealthiest time period, when you don't even have to go to war. The tribute just comes to you. When what can be produced by the craftsman is of a quality that you cannot possibly believe. Everyone's eating well, everyone is getting good money, everyone is happy. This guy comes into power, he starts out his reign depicting himself much like his father did before him, and then all of a sudden, boom, he starts depicting himself like this. And he changes his name to Akhenaten, and he changes the religion, and he starts funneling money away from the other religion, like the Amun-Re temple and the Ptah temple and all these other places. He funnels that money to a new god, a god named Aten. and he starts to depict himself as male and female. Do you see the breasts? You can't see the hips in this one, but there are hips too. He starts to depict himself as animal and human. If you saw it from the side, you would see a prognathism of the lower face. He starts to depict himself strangely elongated, and I would argue that he's depicting himself as a being of light. He is changing the way kingship is depicted. He is changing the way the chief priest, that would be the king, is connecting with all of the divinities, and Nefertiti comes along for the ride. He changes her depiction in very much the same way. Same prognathism, the same elongated features, exaggerated eyes and chin, a very strange visage to behold. And here he is, with all his servants now bent down around him, worshiping the sun god over his head, giving offerings to that sun god, the Aten, and its rays are bathing him in its golden light. He is the only one that should have direct connection with that sun god. Around year 5, he decides to pick up and move away from Memphis, Heliopolis, Thebes, and go to this out in the middle of nowhere place where he says it is sacred to no god or goddess, and build this new city from scratch. He calls it Akhet-Aten. His name is Akhenaten. It's like king and city are almost one. And in about 10 years or less, he builds from the ground up new temples, new palaces, new administrative structures. He makes all of his elites come, and they're going to build all of their estates as well. This is an incredibly energetic and dedicated king to his new cult, and Nefertiti comes along for the ride. She is his great royal wife, and when she comes to Akhet-Aten, she is given a new name, and her name is Neferusobek Nefertiti. There will be an exam after. It's going to get way worse. Way worse. This is one reason why it's so hard to find Nefertiti in the evidence, because Akhenaten seems to have renamed her each step of the way, and she gets to keep a small part of herself as she goes to the next step. You'll see what I mean in a bit. They show these images of family togetherness. Nefertiti is depicted about the same scale as her husband Akhenaten. They're cuddling their daughters. They're showing new and different kinds of scenes. And Egyptologists for the longest time have looked at this as puppies and rainbows and this beautiful togetherness, and maybe even the first monotheism in all of human history, though that is still very much up for debate. But there is a much darker underbelly to all of this. Well, he married 2 of those daughters and had children with them and elevated each of them to great royal wife. So that creeps you out right there, though that's not culturally aberrant for them. He also co-opts his elite, and here you see the elite reaching up and the king and his queen, Nefertiti, just throwing down solid gold necklaces. How do you get a bunch of people to leave their families and their lives in the traditional capitals and move away to middle of nowhere? Well, you bribe them, and then they coerce other people to do the same. And so here we see just this co-option happening before our eyes, but in a more idealistic sort of sense. But what's really interesting in the work that's coming out right now by a number of bioarchaeologists, one of them a former student of mine from UCLA, Ann Austin, they're finding graveyards filled with the laborers who constructed this city from the ground up. And the graveyards for the skilled laborers are fine. They get grave goods, they're doing okay. But the graveyards for those who are not so skilled, who are just hauling stones and doing what they're told, are horrific. They're working wounded, they're working malnourished, they're working with acute fractures. And even worse than that, they have found a graveyard filled with hundreds of children, separated from any sort of adult figures of any kind, also working with all kinds of injuries, malnourished, and with acute injuries as well. And the people who work in this graveyard are emotionally affected themselves with each burial that they find. This has been so disruptive to our understanding of what Akhenaten's regime was, that it's actually made most Egyptians that I know very uncomfortable. And when this work was first presented at a conference, at a bioarchaeology conference, Egyptians left not all, left the room and said, you can't present the kingship this way. This is serious stuff, because it's turning on its head what the foundation of Akhenaten's kingship actually was. This was a demanding king, a king who was quite brutal to his people. And Nefertiti came along for the ride. And indeed, I say most Egyptologists now see this new king, co-king alongside Akhenaten with the name that rolls off the tongue, Ankh-Khepru-Re Nefer-Neferu-Aten as Nefertiti. She's not identifiable as Nefertiti any longer, but that Nefer-Neferu-Re is still there. And so people are like, oh, okay, Ankh-Khepru-Re, that's her as co-king. This is a weird and crazy thing, and this is a breaker of all of our patterns. She's not stepping in as a regent for a boy king. She's stepping in alongside her husband. I just told you, you're not supposed to have those parallel power structures, right? It's supposed to be a linear. Well, he must feel very vulnerable. This is potentially the only person that he can trust. He pulls in somebody to help him to continue this rule, happens to be his great royal wife, now no longer, and now a co-king. And one Egyptologist, Nicholas Reeves, even believes that the mask and all of the burial equipment of Tutankhamun, including the 3 nesting coffins, was not made for Tutankhamun, but was made for a certain Ankh-Khepru-Re. And indeed, he's shown, and I stood next to the case when they opened the glass, and I got to see the mask and the shoulder from that far away, so I'm a believer too. And he's shown this to Dieter Arnold, Mark Gabold, and Ray Johnson. They also buy it, that this is recarved, and that the traces of the old name are Ankh-Khepru-Re, which is the coolest thing ever. It makes all the Egyptologists go, ah! Because this could have been made for Nefertiti. This that is burned into your mind's eye, right? That you can see without me even showing you this. That could have been made for Nefertiti as co-king for her husband Akhenaten. And I'm not going to go into this, but I have interesting ideas about the double cobra uraeus, which is also unusual and not something that you see on other burial equipment. And what's going on here? A graduate student of mine, Nicholas Brown, we argue about this all the time. We'll continue to argue about it. And I encourage my graduate students to argue with me. It makes life more fun. Did Nefertiti then become sole king after the death of Akhenaten? And this was where the Egyptologists really start to throw the blows at each other. Because I would say, 40% believe that, yeah, Nefertiti is there stepping in as sole king after the death of Akhenaten in a time period of crisis. And other people are like, look, there's just no evidence for it. I'm not going to talk about the tomb. If you guys want to talk about that in the Q&A, we can, but I'm gonna leave that for now. And I told you I'm skipping Tawosret because I ain't got no time, and she's all Game of Thronesy, so you can read the book. This woman was pretty badass, so check her out. Came in as a regent for a son who was not her own, and a kid with a club foot to boot. But let's quickly talk about Cleopatra so we can have some questions and hopefully answers. So Cleopatra of the Ptolemaic dynasty also does not rule alone. She also rules for almost 22 years, like Hatshepsut before her. She rules alongside Ptolemy XII, who needs a co-ruler and brings Cleopatra VII into the situation. She rules alongside, though in many ways quite unwillingly, her brother Ptolemy XIII, and he dies in battle fighting against her. Then she moves on to Ptolemy XIV, whom she has assassinated. So now that she's killed all of her Ptolemaic companions and has no one else to bed with and to rule with, Cleopatra is so canny, she still knows she cannot rule alone. Egypt is no longer happily ensconced in its own little bubble of geographic protection, however. It is now perched on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea from its capital city of Alexandria. It is part of a globalized Mediterranean world. So she's got to look to a globalized partner, and she launches upon, or he launches upon her, Julius Caesar. We all know the story. She's snuck into his chambers as he's in the palace of Alexandria in a bedroll. Her brother is sieging the city. It's perfect. She gets in, and they hang out for a couple of months, and she's going to give birth to Caesarion, known as Ptolemy XV, to Egyptologists sometime after that. This works out quite well for her. She's got a Roman warlord to rule and partner with. He's a sperm donor to boot. She doesn't even have to marry the guy. He doesn't want to marry her. She doesn't want to marry him. That wouldn't quite work. But as a partnership of rule, this is quite useful. But we all know what happens. She's in Rome when he is murdered on the steps of the Senate. She has to hightail it back to Alexandria and figure out what to do. And she needs another partner. She knows she cannot rule alone. And so she launches upon Mark Antony. She shows up. He apparently writes her multiple times, meet me in Anatolia, meet me at Tarsus, and come and visit. Come in. And she's playing hard to get. No. And finally, She shows up dressed to the nines, dressed as a goddess in this barge that is covered with gold, just showing her wealth and her riches. The Romans go crazy writing about this, saying, look at this woman who wastes money. Look at all of this excess. This is what kingship gives you. This is horrible. Well, Cleopatra knew exactly what she was doing, depicting herself as a goddess, nothing less than a goddess, as a beholder of great wealth. She wants these Roman warlords to work with her and do what she says. She needs to make sure that they see that she's holding many cards herself. They need the money. They're constantly fighting each other in a civil war that never ends. They need cash. She's got some cash. Perfect partnership. Better in terms of age as well when she launches up with Mark Antony. Now, Cleopatra, I say she's a failure. She does not leave Egypt better than she finds it. It becomes a province of Rome after her death. However, Cleopatra comes the closest out of any of the women that we're talking about in having it all, in being the man, in a sense, at the center of the wheel of power. Because she has such a strong womb and constitution, she is able to, I hate this thing. Wait, hold on. National Geographic made me do this, and they want it to be animated. I'm like, oh, okay, let's try again. And every time I mess up the animation. Here we go. And do I do another? Yes. One more. Boom. Okay. So she comes the closest out of any of our women to creating a legacy of her own genetic lineage that is going to pass on to future generations. She even creates this big show where she names each of her children as leaders of different parts of her Eastern Empire. One kid in charge of Cyrenaica, Libya, one kid in charge of the Levant, one kid in charge of Cyprus, and so on and so forth. And they don't seem to be fighting with each other. She seems to have created a family that's not trying to kill each other constantly, which for the Ptolemies is a serious win. And it looks like she has it all working out in her favor. She doesn't have to marry Mark Antony, but he seems to be staying in Egypt. They have a real chance of creating an Eastern dynasty that can work in opposition to that Western dynasty that is Rome. And yet, it all goes horribly wrong. Mark Antony, before this happens, invades Parthia. What do they say about a land invasion of Asia? A land war in Asia. Did anyone see The Princess Bride? Never have a land war in Asia. He tries that. It goes horribly wrong, and he never recovers from it financially, emotionally, physically. And then they're on the back foot when they try to fight Octavian, soon to become Caesar Augustus. They're on the back foot. They don't have maybe all of the allies that they could or all of the strong allies that they could, didn't prepare for it properly. They certainly didn't strategize it well in terms of how the battle should happen. Should we be surprised that Cleopatra, as the woman, hightails it out of there as soon as she sees what's going on? The Romans write about this and they say, look at that coward. Look at her run. Mark Antony only stays for a little bit longer before he also flees with his life intact. But, you know, I guess he let a little more of his soldiers die before, and that makes him strong and powerful. More manly, more noble. But anyway, this goes horribly wrong. If it didn't go horribly wrong, I think we would talk about Cleopatra very differently. But we can't. I can't write a revisionist history. I can't make her make a different choice. As it is now, she is meant to wait out the year in Alexandria, trying to save her children, trying to figure out how to get herself out of this deep, dark hole. And given that she's had all of her children with two Roman warlords who have now died in a civil war or some other political aggression, she has a target on her back and on her children's backs that she cannot remove. There's nothing that she can really do to get herself out of this situation. And the story is that she then commits suicide. It's a wonderful story for the Romans to give us. While this is happening, her children, all but one, are hunted down and murdered. Caesarion, known as Ptolemy the 15th to us, is heading down south to flee, and he receives a letter, you're going to be made king by Octavian. It's going to be okay. He comes back. You may think it's naive, but the Romans had allowed the Ptolemies to rule this place for some time. So I think maybe he thought he could get away with it. Well, he's murdered on the way back. Other sons and daughters are murdered as well. Cleopatra herself is said to commit suicide. This works very well for Octavian's propaganda. It's the reason that I am so suspicious of anything the Romans tell us about Cleopatra and her manner of dying. Because There's no way to know. We don't even know what the manner of suicide is. I once listened to a whole academic discussion, a panel discussion about whether it was an asp or whether it was this or whether it was that, and there really is no way to know how Cleopatra committed suicide, or I would argue if she even did. It makes the most sense for Octavian to say, oh, she took a hero's way out, committed suicide, much the way they say Boudica left us or Zenobia left us. It works for the hero's way out, but for the Egyptians, it's brutal because it's the mother abandoning her children to their fates. It's the mother not wanting to have to be walked in chains in a triumph, deciding to just screw it, I'm done with this, and just leave everybody behind. From the Egyptian perspective, to say that she committed suicide is one of the most brutally affected pieces of propaganda that Octavian could ever produce. And it is the reason that I am so suspicious of it. Again, until I get my time machine, I'll never be able to prove it true or false, but this is where I fall. So, it's 250, yay. Where else did women try to rule the world? Well, nowhere like Egypt, but there are other women. Jezebel, Athaliah, her daughter, who tried to rule on behalf of her son, both killed for trying. Boudica and Zenobia both fought Rome and died. Empress Le, Empress Wu Zetian ruled for extended periods of time in imperial China, also never ruled alone, ruled alongside others. And of course, we know the many female rulers of a fragmented Europe, including Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, et cetera, different situation in a fragmented Europe where you don't want a Spanish cousin to come in just because he's male, and you would rather have the female because she's British. So this is more a situation where the fragmentation of Europe works for the females, in the females' favor. In all of these cases, in Egypt and elsewhere, almost all, success is ignored, and the failure is aggrandized. We have a cultural memory of the failures, like Cleopatra. Shakespeare writes plays about Cleopatra. We have epic poems about Semiramis, who also was a ruler of the ancient Near East, who apparently epically failed. But those women who did it all right, women like Neferusobek, women like Hatshepsut, who left Egypt better than they found it, are the ones that are not part of our cultural memory, whose names were effectively replaced, and to whom credit, from whom credit was taken away and given to the men who either preceded them or came after. And so in the end, I usually end this discussion with this. And I am trying, so just a quick point, and then I'll let you guys ask me a couple questions. I am trying to make this as topical as I possibly can. I'm trying to bring this back to why do we still distrust females in power? What is it about the female that sets us so on edge? What is it about the possible lies of a female candidate that are so much more powerful than the absolute untruths of the male candidate? What's going on here? And why are we still in this conundrum? And this, I think, is the reason. That we assign women a mercurial nature. We assign women ups and downs of emotionality that cannot be controlled. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you this is true, because I actually don't believe it is. I, first of all, don't believe that we only have male and female. We are the ones that have culturally constructed a binary. When you talk about transgender and you talk about the complications of sexuality, if you talk to a biologist and talk about all of the sexual expressions that are allowed for we humans, for us humans, it's extraordinary. This is an oversimplified agricultural system. But this is what we live with, this is what we have. And so then I'll look at this and I would like to turn this on its head and say, if we assume that females are so much more emotional than men, and if cognitive scientists do tell us that on the whole, you and I can read each other's faces better, that we actually are more in touch with our emotions, less likely to, I don't know, stalk an ex-spouse or pick up a gun and kill up the whole family and then kill ourselves because we're not in touch with our emotions, right? If that is the case, then I would encourage all of us to look at this emotionality more positively and think of that emotionality, whether wielded by men or by women, as the ability to feel something before you decisively act upon it. That this emotionality could be the very thing that gets